All right, in this video, we are going to talk about how to solve quadratic equations with the use of factoring. Okay, so the very first thing that we need to talk about is called the principle of zero products, right? Because this is important for solving equations using factoring. So the principle of zero product says, hey, if I have two numbers, right, two real numbers, A and B, and I multiply them together and get zero, then either one number or the other, or possibly both, have to be zero. Okay? And if you think about it, that's totally true, right? If the two numbers are both positive, then when I multiply them together, I get a positive, right? Or if they're both negative, I also get a positive. And if one's positive and one's negative, I'll get a negative number, not zero, right? So if I multiply two numbers, right, and I get zero, then the result is either one or both of those numbers has to get zero. If you think about it, right, zero is kind of special in that sense. There's really no other number that you can say that about, right? If I told you, hey, I'm thinking of two numbers in my head, right, and when I multiply them together, I get 10, right? That really doesn't narrow things down at all, right? Because I could be talking about 1 and 10, right? I could be talking about 2 and 5. I could be talking about -1 and -10. Could be talking about -2 and -5. Right? But it gets even worse than that. I could be talking about a half and 20. I could be talking about 1/4 and 40, right? I could be talking about 1/8 and 80, right? And the list never ends, right? In fact, if you give me any number, right, over here, say 52, right, then I can say, well, that's 10 over 52, right? Times 52 gives me 10. So that really doesn't narrow it down at all with a 10, okay? On the other hand, right, if I told you, hey, A times B equals 0, then automatically, right, you know either A is 0 or B is 0, and possibly both of them could be 0, right? One of those things has to be true, and that's it. So it really allows you, the fact that this number over here is 0 really allows you to narrow down what these numbers are. The same thing is important about multiplication, right? If I tell you, hey, I'm thinking of two numbers and when I add them together I get 0, well, that again doesn't narrow things down at all. I could be thinking of 1 and -1, or 2 and -2, or 3 and -3, and so on and so forth, right? So just because two things are adding together to get 0 doesn't allow you to figure out what either of these numbers might be. The possibilities are endless, right? That way. So both of those things are extremely important, right? This side over here has to be factored, right? It has to be written as a multiplication problem. So that's why in the previous videos we've been talking about factoring. So you have to factor this side, and then you have to have 0 over on the other side in order to be able to use this principle of zero products. Okay? All right, so that leads us to solving quadratic equations by factoring, right? A quadratic equation is an equation of this form: ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, right? So an equation of this form right here. So we've already talked about linear equations, solving those, right? We've done that already. So quadratic equations are kind of the next step up in complexity from linear equations. Okay? So we're going to talk about solving these. So the general method is to get 0 on one side of the equation. So you would do that by adding or subtracting all of the terms over onto one side of the equation. Step 2 would be to factor the non-zero side completely. And then the third step would be to set each factor equal to 0 and solve using the principle of zero products. Okay? So essentially what's going to be happening here is we're going to take in a quadratic equation and change it in for two linear equations. Okay. All right, let's take a look at an example of how this would go. All right, so our first example here is t squared minus 12 equals 4t. All right, so looking at this equation, we can see right off the bat, right, we can see that it is a quadratic, right, because of the 2 up here. A linear equation, right, will not have this squared up here, right? And it's important that you understand, right, the difference between a linear and a quadratic, because you do two different things when solving those, all right? So we now know this is a quadratic, right? What we would do is to subtract 4t from both sides, right? Get all of the terms on one side and 0 on the other side. All right, so subtracting 4t gives us this expression over here on the left side. All right, so I've got 0 on one side, everything over on the other side. Next, I want to factor this as much as possible. All right, so remember the first step in factoring is to look for the greatest common factor. Here, the greatest common factor is 1, so that does not help at all. Okay, so next up, I want to factor this as much as possible. I can see that it has 3 terms, right? So I am going to use the AC method to factor it, all right? To use the AC method, I would need 2 numbers that multiply to give me 1 times negative 12 is negative 12, right? So in this case, my A is 1, all right? So there's an understood 1 here. My C is negative 12, so AC would be negative 12. So I'm needing 2 numbers that will multiply together to give me negative 12 that will add up into negative 4 here, okay? All right, so let's run through the possibilities. I could have 1 and 12, 2 and 6, right, 3 and 4, and that's about it. And I'm looking for, right, these pairs that will either add or subtract to give me a 4. And I can see right here that 6 and the 2 look promising, right? Because 6 minus 2 is a 4, which at least matches in absolute value with this, okay? So, kind of suspecting that 2 and 6 are going to be involved in this, right? Looking at the 2 numbers, they have to multiply to give me negative 12. So I know that one has to be positive and one has to be negative. And I want them to add up to give me negative 4, right? And so the bigger number here is going to have to be the negative, right? So just checking. What's 2 times negative 6? It's negative 12. Check. What's 2 plus negative 6? It's negative 4. So that works out. So these were the 2 numbers that I was looking for. Okay. All right. Next up, I would use those 2 numbers, right, to split this term up and factor by grouping, okay? And that will absolutely work, but I also kind of want to show you a shortcut. All right, so in the first examples, if you were watching the other videos about the AC method, I purposely did the more complicated examples, right? And the complicated ones are the ones where the number, your A, is anything besides 1, okay? So if you look back through those examples that we did, all of them were of the more complicated variety. The easy example is where this number with the squared term is a 1, and that's this case. And it turns out that if that's so, then all you have to do is put those numbers in the binomial expression themselves, like this. All right. So that's a bonus for those of you watching this video, right? I showed you a shortcut how this would work. I would just take, when this number is a 1, right, then you would just take these numbers and put them in there. A positive 2 will be t plus 2, or x plus 2, whatever variable you use. And the negative will be a negative 6 like this, okay? So that makes it a little bit faster. All right, so just to show you, hey, that works with what I was saying previously, if you did it the long way, right, you would do split this negative 4 up into plus 2t minus 6t, right, using those numbers if you're using my AC method. Or it's not mine, but the AC method. If you're using another method, you can just kind of ignore this for the time being. And then you would factor those numbers out in the factoring by grouping. And then you would pull the t plus 2 out. So just to show you that works out exactly the same if you do it the longer way, you can see that it does. Okay. Some people always like to do it this way. They just want to know the one way to do it, and so they always do it the long way. That's perfectly fine. So, but there's a little bit of a shortcut for it. Okay, so next up, right, what we are doing is now we've got this equation. The left side is completely factored. The right-hand side is 0, right? So what we're saying is that, hey, if I take t plus 2 and t minus 6 and multiply them together, I get 0, right? By the principle of zero products that we talked about, that means either t plus 2 is 0 or t minus 6 is 0, okay, or both. All right. So if t plus 2 is 0, then I can just solve that equation and get that t equals minus 2. And this one, right, I can add 6 to both sides, and I get t equals 6. And so there are my two solutions, negative 2 and a positive 6. We've solved this equation, okay? So kind of what we're doing here is trading in one quadratic equation, right, for two linear ones that we've studied before. Okay, so that is how to solve a quadratic by factoring. All right, so I have a couple more examples that I'm going to work out, but I am going to split those into subsequent videos.